Janelle Brown had thought that she was able to make her own decisions. She was an independent and intelligent young woman with the strength of character to choose how she wanted to live. But that was about to come to an end on one particular cold November morning, when the phone rings with a call from her father. "Janelle, I've picked out a husband for you," he said matter-of-factly, as if that were the most normal information in the universe. Janelle froze, her own hand gripping the phone more tightly than she realized. She blinked, wondering if she had just misunderstood him. "What just happened?" she was able to ask, her voice shaking in shock. "May?" he asked, as though he had just suddenly heard me call. "A husband, I said I have picked one for you," he said, his voice now devoid of room for argument. "Your wedding date is next month, and all is being set in place. You will soon know who he is," he said. Her heart was racing so hard, she could feel the beats through her throat. The words, "chosen husband," repeated inside her head. She had envisioned her life unfolding differently. She would fall in love on her own terms, choose her husband based on her own desires, not on what her father wanted. Now, here she was, staring at a reality where her choices had been made by someone else. Janelle attempted to reason, to convince her father of her logic. "Dad, this isn't fair. I'm not a child, for goodness sake. I ought to pick my husband myself." Her father's tone eased, but he still spoke firmly. "I understand that you feel you are prepared to make these kinds of decisions, but sometimes tradition takes a backseat to your family. I am doing the best things for you, Janelle." The words struck her like a sledgehammer. Her father had never been a cruel man, but he was stubborn, unswerving, and very entrenched in his own convictions. As far as he was concerned, he was doing the best thing for her, marrying her off to a man that he felt was worthy of her. Yet Janelle couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal, as if her whole life was not hers to control. After the phone call, Janelle was left seated in her apartment, her silence punctuated only by her blank stares at the wall of her apartment, as her room, once a source of comfort, seemed to suffocate her. She was flooded with memories of past arguments with her father, when she had tried to stand up for herself, only for her father to remind her of her subordinate position. And now, things had just gotten even tougher for her, creating lives that revolve around love, trust, and mutual respect. Why could she not have this choice? How could her father have the right to refuse her own desires and happiness? Tears began to well up in her eyes, not from anger or frustration alone, but from the realization of how helpless she felt in that moment. But beneath this feeling of fear and anger, a spark of strength ignited. Janelle would not let this happen in silence. She would not allow herself to be forced into a life she did not choose. Over the next few days, Janelle attempted to understand the situation that had developed. She researched her father's intentions and attempted to gather information on this stranger that her father had picked out for her. She was surprised to discover that this individual was polite and well-educated and had a good job. By all standards, he was the ideal man that anyone could look up to. To her, however, he was the embodiment of all that was wrong with having control taken away and her life mapped out for her. Her mind was filled with all the possible scenarios. Would she be able to persuade her father to change his mind? Would she be able to find a way to back out of the deal without any problems rising between her and her family? One thing was for sure, she was going to have to do something, because she certainly wasn't going to let things go as they were. Janelle also looked back at her past experiences with love. Of course, she had been in love, been broken-hearted, and had learned her lessons the hard way, but not this time. This was about her freedom, her right to choose one of the most crucial decisions of her life, something she was not willing to bargain for. One evening, sitting by the window of her room and watching the lights of the city flickering below, Janelle made a silent vow to herself. She vowed that she would not allow this man, selected by her father, to determine the course of the rest of her life. On the other hand, she couldn't deny the emotions raging within her. Fear, anger, curiosity, and even a hint of excitement swirled together into a twisted mix. What would it be like to meet this man? Would he be gracious and humble, or arrogant and condescending? Would he be able to see things in perspective, or would he simply follow her father's lead? This uncertainty terrified her, but at the same time, it fueled her as well. She understood that days to come will prove whether she possesses courage, intelligence, and patience to match the challenges that awaited her. In these critical situations, she also needed a strategy. Therefore, Janelle started preparing for the meeting. She made a list of all the questions that she intended to ask, analyzed her arguments, and even thought of ways on how the situation could subtly work out in her favor. However, deep inside, Janelle was also aware that she had to be cautious. This was because if she made the wrong step, the situation could worsen, and her opportunity to assert her independence could slip away from her hands. Janelle looked forward to the day of her new husband, as she eagerly awaited the day. She could not sleep, she could not eat, and she kept imagining all the different ways her day could go. Would she like him if he is kind and charming? Would she like him even if he is arrogant and stubborn? Despite the maelstrom of emotions, one thing was very clear. Janelle was not going to be a reactive participant in her own life. She was intent on taking back her power, her voice, and her happiness, no matter what the future held for her and whoever it was she decided to be with. In the evenings, sitting by the window, watching the twinkling stars among the lights of the city, Janelle made a silent vow. She would stand up to her father, to the man he had selected for her, to the coming tempest with the strength, ingenuity, and soul that lay within her. Little did she realize, this stunning revelation was only the first salvo in what promised to be a very challenging few months ahead. The ultimate trial of will, strength, and wit was yet to be weathered, and it would call into question all she thought she knew about love, family, and the strength of choice in determining one's own path in life. The dreaded and secretly prepared for day finally arrived. Her father had set up a private meeting with the man he had selected to be her future husband. A vortex of nerves swirled in Janelle's stomach. 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Who was this man? Would he be arrogant, charming, or indifferent? Could she even like him? Or worse, could she fall for him? Her father had been adamant. The meeting was to proceed as scheduled, without incident. But Janelle knew today was something more than a simple meet and greet, which was a real test of her strength, wit, and patience. She had to play the meeting just so, learning all she could while subtler assertions of independence were made. As she walked into the appointed cafe, her father was already there, sat at a quiet corner table. The man he had selected was running a few minutes late, and Janelle's nerves did not improve with each ticking minute. Silently, she practiced her words, cautioning herself to not freak out, to refrain from showing weakness, and above all, to not let her father notice her doubts. Then the door opened, and he was inside. Janelle's breath caught. He was taller than she had envisioned, with a quiet confidence that commanded attention. His suit was simple yet elegant. His expression, upon catching her gaze, polite yet inscrutable. He gave a slight, respectful nod to her father, then to Janelle herself, and sat down opposite them. For a moment, it was as if the world was shrinking to just the three of them. The soft music in the cafe and the cups rattling became dimmed into the background. Janelle regarded him keenly, searching for clues about his personality or any hint of his intentions that might give her the upper hand in this rather sensitive meeting. Her father, ever the traditionalist, began speaking first, introducing the man to her formally. "Janelle, this is Michael," he said. "He is a good man, respectful, and someone I believe is perfect for you." Michael, ever the gentleman, nodded politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Janelle. I have heard quite a lot about you," he said calmly, measuring his voice. Janelle made herself return the greeting, even as her mind was racing. "Nice to meet you," she ventured cautiously, keeping a close eye on him. She took in the way he carried himself, polite, respectful, but not overly friendly. He wasn't attempting to charm her or press some kind of dominance. He was just there, like her, caught in a situation beyond his control. The first couple of minutes were spent in an awkward conversation. Her father spoke relentlessly about Michael's achievements, character, and suitability as a husband. Janelle nodded politely, her ears open, while mentally cataloging every little detail. This was not just about meeting her future husband. This was reconnaissance, finding him out before she had to navigate the next step in this forced arrangement. Paragraph. As she continued talking, Janelle began to notice little things about Michael that showed his real character. He listened more than he talked, asking insightful questions rather than making assumptions. He maintained eye contact without being intimidating, smiled occasionally, and seemed genuinely interested in her responses. There was a quiet strength to him, a patience that contrasted sharply with the control of her father. Paragraph. Janelle felt a flicker of surprise. Could someone her father chose actually be decent? Could he even be kind? She shook the thought away quickly. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted by possibilities of kindness. It was about control, about making a statement with her independence, about keeping her life hers. Her father finally excused himself, leaving the two of them alone in the room. The dynamics changed immediately. Janelle's heart started beating wildly as she realized that this was her time, the opportunity to test Michael without the looming shadow of her father. "So, you must be nervous," Michael said, the first to break the silence. His tone was gentle, almost empathetic. Janelle was taken aback by his insight. How could he know? But instead of responding right away, she studied him, searching for motives, weaknesses, anything she could get to use to assert control over this encounter. "A little," she said carefully. "I guess I just wasn't expecting this." "I understand," he replied. "This isn't easy for either of us. But I want to be open with you. I didn't choose this any more than you did. I'm here because I respect your father and want to approach this with care." Janelle blinked. His honesty took her by surprise. Most people in this position would charm, manipulate, or impress, but Michael was utterly forthright, almost vulnerable in his calmness. For the first time since her father's announcement, Janelle felt a strange flutter of relief. She wasn't alone in this. He too swam through a life he hadn't chosen. The conversation got personal. They talked about hobbies, interests, favorite books, and dreams. Scanty information, but telling. Michael spoke of his childhood, his struggles, and moments that had molded him into the man he presently was. And Janelle listened closely, observing his integrity, patience, and quieted confidence. Yet even with all those positive traits, Janelle's mind remained cautious. She kept reminding herself, she wasn't here to fall in love. She was here to assess, to strategize, to ensure her independence. She couldn't afford distraction, not now. As the meeting continued, the barriers began to break, and a subtle connection was formed. They laughed at shared jokes, exchanged thoughtful comments, and the tension slowly loosened. Janelle noticed she wasn't wholly on the defensive anymore. There was some curiosity, intrigue, even reluctant respect. But those feelings were quickly batted away. It wasn't about romance yet. It was about survival and control. Minutes turned into an hour, and the conversation became more serious. Janelle was straightforward in asking Michael his views on marriage, respect, and partnership. His responses were measured, insightful, and even progressive. He spoke of equality, communication, and understanding, things that reached deep into Janelle's core. For one quick second, she had to wonder what it would have been like if she had chosen him herself. But in the same flash, she reminded herself of her ultimate goal, taking back control over her own life. She needed to tread this cautiously, keep the conversation going, feel him out on a few issues, and see his reaction. By the time the meeting ended, a cocktail of feelings battled within Janelle's brain. Confusion, curiosity, and that tad of something she couldn't quite name. Michael hadn't been threatening, nor was he pushy. He had been respectful, kind, and shockingly genuine. Yet, the bottom line remained. Her father had chosen him, and the power dynamics of their situation were still askew. As they parted ways, Janelle's mind was racing. She had learned quite a bit about Michael tonight, his character and his values and integrity. But far more valuable was the realization that he wasn't an enemy. He was, in fact, fighting the same constraints she was. And that knowledge, strangely enough, gave her hope. Walking back to her apartment, Janelle realized something vital. The forthcoming days would be all about strategy, subtle influence, and understanding. She needed to find a way to take this affair, flip it onto its head, and ultimately be independent, with a man who just might not be as predictable as she assumed. The meeting had left her with a salient lesson. Sometimes, the people placed in your path out of the blue aren't barricades, they're potential allies. And in the game her father had begun, Janelle knew she would have to be artful, patient, and fearless. The storm of emotions she felt when she first heard the announcement was still far from over. But for the first time, she also felt a glimmer of confidence. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't a victim. And she was ready to make that forced introduction into an opportunity, one that could very well set her life in a different direction forever. Little did she know her next meeting with Michael would be a trial of an even greater order. It wouldn't be about strategy or control, but a test of emotions, guts, and above all, the heart. And when that day came, Janelle would have to decide what she truly wanted, and whether she could fight for it. Following her first encounter with Michael, Janelle came back home with a whirlwind of emotions within her. There was relief, a certain curiosity, and a very small flicker of respect for what her father had picked for her. Struggling with a certain anger, a certain frustration, and a certain determination, for her to regain control of her life. There was, however, one thing of which she was very sure. She was not going to allow her father to dictate her happiness, however pleasant and genuine he appeared to be. Janelle spent most of the evening pacing around her apartment, reliving every second of her encounter with Michael. She eyed Michael's subtlety of reaction, the way he listened, kept control of himself, and hesitated every time he mentioned her father's name. She realized she was no different from him. He, like her, was following a road of no choice of his own. It was then when a plan struck her. Maybe, just maybe, she could meld this entire ordeal into something advantageous to her while not showing her hand. Her mind began to strategize. First, she needed information. Every bit about Michael was important. How he thought, what he valued, and how he performed under pressure. She began by looking at every encounter she'd ever had with him. How he spoke, how he moved, even his subtlest expression, down to the smallest detail. Such as the way he cocked his head when he was interested, the way he shook hands. Then, she considered her father. His domineering character was a matter of family legend, but not even he was untainted. He needed respect and submission, and he thought that tradition entitled him to this. Janelle understood and if she could find a way to point out a few fault lines in his scheme, without directly contradicting him, she could possibly use these to her advantage. Over the following days, Janelle started working on her plan. She began conducting herself in ways that showed her interest in Michael, through her cordiality, expressions of curiosity, and questions. She asked about his interests, his previous romantic involvements, as well as his opinions about marriage, observing his facial expressions. She laughed at his jokes that lacked much humor, shared personal anecdotes, which exposed her in small ways, or even asked questions designed to try his patience. Yet, as she watched him, something unexpected occurred. Michael proved to be very understanding and insightful. He did not become defensive about her probing questions. Rather, his answers were calculated, almost as if he understood her game. This left Janelle both amazed and irked. He was exactly the sort of man who could thwart her plans. At the same time, she realized that she could use him as an ally. Meanwhile, her father was getting impatient with her. He called her often, reminding her of the timeline, insisting that everything was going according to plan with the wedding preparations. He thought she was cooperating quietly, but Janelle had been able to put on a cool and amiable front that masked her plans. One evening, she sat at her desk and wrote a list of what she needed to do mentally by herself. To learn about Michael completely, to understand his character, his values, and point out his weaknesses, his pride, his emphasis on obedience, his fear of scandal. Identify her kind and control the narrative. To make sure that each and every interaction that she had after meeting these two men had something to do with push the boundaries, cajole Michael into revealing just how far he might go in exercising his independence. Brace for the ultimate showdown, the time she could declare her own voice boldly, expecting no retaliation. Janelle saw that her scheme was not only about revenge, but about empowerment. She was doing everything that enhanced her strength, including learning how to deal with tricky relationships and speaking up in a world that had been muffled by her voice. She now experienced a sense of power that she had not felt in a long time, and it frightened as well as exhilarated her. But as she went on, she began to realize the effect Michael was having on her emotions. The animosity she and Michael first shared started to dissipate and was replaced with a certain chemistry between them. Michael respected her limits, conversed with her on a deep emotional level, and even disputed some of the ideas she shared, making her think critically. Yet Janelle could feel the complexity of emotions. Yet she told herself again and again, the only thing she sought was her independence. The next part of the plan had to do with social interactions. Janelle arranged for social interactions to happen, carefully listening to Michael's reactions to social situations. This way, she could understand how he dealt with people, his kindness, patience, and skill to handle some tough talk. At the same time, she observed how he reacted to her father, listening to his expectations, as well as the control he tried to exert. Janelle also understood the significance of communication strategy. She started thinking the way a negotiator would. She thought about how she would make her moves in the negotiation process, and how she would display them. Even the slightest details were mulled over. This is because she realized that the forthcoming period was going to be an intricate dance. A single mistake would undermine the whole strategy. However, her intention was not completely malicious. Janelle also needed honesty, respect, and collaboration in her life. She understood the value of having a partnership that was based on mutual respect and understanding. And if Michael was to be trusted, their marriage could be something more than just something they ought to do. Janelle's plan was, thus, twofold: independence and the possibility of something more. Janelle spent hours contemplating various scenarios in her mind. How would Michael react if she used her subtle manipulations on him? What if her father found out about her intentions? What if her emotions developed beyond her plan? Analysis of all possible contingencies was done. She knew that she needed both intellect and toughness in her plan. And as the weeks passed, so did Janelle's confidence. She began to recognize the bigger picture, how her father's attempt to run her life had actually given her a chance to prove that she was smart, brave, and independent. Each chat she had with Michael, each encounter she had with her father, it was all part of regaining control of her life. Finally, she thought about the end result, the wedding day. That's going to be the payoff, she thought, when I can make my statement. Entirely visualizing herself at the wedding, standing at the altar, cool and calm and very much in control, ready to take on her father and make her statement, she felt strong and determined. This wasn't just a plan for a fight. This was also a plan for a transformation from being her father's daughter to being herself. Janelle's revenge had little to do with harming her father or Michael. It was all about taking back control of her voice, of making a statement that would show the world that she was strong, and that no one else would ever decide what the future held for her again. And as Janelle sat in the quiet of her apartment, scribbling down notes, practicing conversations, and working everything out in her mind, she finally realized just how true that was. Revenge was only the tip of the iceberg. What she was working towards was so much more. It was a life of her own choosing. Little did she know, her future interactions with Michael would put her skills and intellect to the test, but even more so, her heart. She would soon be faced with emotions and the realities of her plan, and a choice of whether her brilliant revenge could possibly happen alongside her chance for love. Janelle smiled lightly, a flicker of anticipation dancing in her eyes. She was ready. She would not be a victim. She would not be controlled. And she would make sure, come what may, that she was in control of her own life. The game was underway, and Janelle Brown was going to win. Finally, the day of the wedding arrived. The sun had barely risen, but the world outside Janelle's window seemed to vibrate with excitement. Her heart thrummed within her chest like the beat of a drum, pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. After so long a period of planning, strategizing, and carefully maneuvering her way through the engagement dictated by her father, today marked the day she had to endure the biggest test of all, the wedding itself. The place was stunning. White flowers adorned the way to the altar, golden light shone through the high windows, and the sound of incoming guests buzzed in the background. Everything was carefully orchestrated, thanks to her father's staff, mostly. But today, Janelle was going to put her own imprint on all of this. She had practiced her lines, her facial movements, and her minute actions for months. As she stood, waiting for the start of the ceremony, her mind racing, Janelle had questions she had not expected. Will her father accept her choice? She asked herself. And what about Michael? How will he take her standing up for herself? These questions, as pressing as any she had, were overshadowed, however, by ones she did not realize she had. How will she manage her feelings? A mixture of anxiety, anger, and an odd sense of respect for her partner during her days of planning and strategy. For men like R.R., who had been part of her life during those planning days. Finally, the music started. It was mellow at the beginning, the sound of the piano, but soon the whole orchestra was playing. Janelle took a deep breath and stepped out. The guests turned around. All the eyes were on her. Each step towards the altar was an act of declaration. She was present, she was conscious, and she was about to take matters into her own hands. Her father was standing at the altar, looking proud but agitated, glancing at her again and again. He had expected submission, obedience, maybe even tears of thanks. But what he saw was determination, reserve, and composure that took him by surprise. Janelle looked back at her father, and while her face was polite, it was full of power. This was not the same daughter who had been scared of her father's dominance a few months back. Michael was already waiting at the altar. He looked relaxed and collected, but there is a slight tension evident in his posture. He must certainly have realized that Janelle was not the same woman she used to be, that she has been displaying an intelligence and a strategic mind that she never had before. That she is also a fiery and independent woman. The ceremony started, led by a friend of her father's. The traditional promises were made, and the words washed over the crowd, but Janelle had a plan entirely of her own making. She had a plan for this very situation, one which would allow her to exercise her freedom and will in front of them all. As she waited for her turn to speak, she paused, allowing the silence to linger for just one beat. All eyes in the room were focused on her. Her father's face underwent a subtle transformation. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he marshaled his emotions into control. Janelle's breathing quickened. This is exactly what she had been contemplating for weeks. "Dad," she started, her voice calm, melodious, and unshakable. "I appreciate all that you've done for me. I honor your intentions. However, I must state that I am making my own choice on this particular day." Gasps echoed through the room. Some of the guests murmured among themselves in concern, while others leaned in, fascinated by this unexpected twist. Janelle's father's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he struggled for control of the situation. But it was already too late. Janelle had already established the mood. "I chart the course of my own happiness," she went on, her eyes settling on her father. "Not as you have envisioned, because today I'm here to marry. Not as someone's decision, but as I decide." Michael's face relaxed, a small smile of approval on his lips. This is what he had expected Janelle to do. And now, as she began to take charge of her life, he felt a rush of relief and admiration. He had accepted this marriage on her terms, a move unprecedented in a world where they had been forced to choose. It was the first time that day when the atmosphere in the room changed to some extent. The guests, who came expecting a Norm wedding, realized the dynamics of power and the intensity of courage it took for Janelle to say what she said. Hushed tones of respect started flowing, as if everyone realized the magnitude of what happened. Janelle turned to Michael, her voice steady. "Will you marry me, if it's on my terms?" Michael's expression widened slightly. Then his eyes softened. He reached out and took her hands gently in his own. "I will," Michael said with conviction laced with tenderness. It was in this instant that all the strategies and plans that had brought about her independence came together in one glorious triumph for Janelle. The marriage officiant smiled in response to the unexpected turn of events. With a few formal words, the proceedings resumed, but this time everything was different. It was no longer simply a matter of tradition and dutiful obligation. This was a moment of choice, of empowered decision-making, of one woman's determined claim to decide what the future held for herself. When the vows were exchanged, a wave of emotions washed over Janelle that she had not anticipated. There was her pride, her relief, her strange warmth towards Michael, but then, of course, her anger about her father's playing God with her future. She learned something very valuable then. Her course to freedom had succeeded, but had also presented her with a chance for something else, something created out of mutual respect and understanding, rather than out of sila coercion. Her father, though furious at first, held his tongue, the conflict between his pride and the truth of the matter. Janelle had stood her ground, been heard, and altered the course of her life. This was the first time that her father fully comprehended the fact that his daughter was not a passive player in the drama that was her life, but the author of that life. As the ceremony ended, Janelle and Michael stood up to greet the audience, holding hands. The audience applauded, not merely at the union, but at the bravery that came with it. The newlyweds walked down the aisle, and a feeling of triumph and liberation seemed to emanate from both of them. The reception was quite vibrant and celebratory, but Janelle was alert, observing her father, who was slowly embracing her, his anger replaced with a sense of pride. She also noticed how her guests were affected, either out of admiration for her bravery or a sense of amazement at her boldness, while Michael was right there beside her, a companion not just through marriage, but also through thick and thin, through life itself. As she spent the night, Janelle looked back on how she had arrived in this position. The anger, the calculation, the plotting, it had all building up to now. She had come to understand that revenge was not about causing suffering or humiliation, but about regaining strength, finding her voice, and not being governed by others. By the end of the night, Janelle knew something profound. She had changed. This wedding had not only reinforced the importance of her independence but had shown her the way towards the life she was meant to lead. With the ability to strategically navigate the world and emotionally connect with it, she had conquered the mess of what was expected of her. As the last of the guests left and the area grew quieter, Janelle and Michael had a moment to themselves. "You were amazing today," Michael said softly, his eyes full of admiration. "I knew you had strength, but I had no way of realizing how brave you could be." Janelle smiled as she felt a rush of relief and pride. "I had to, not only for myself, but for the life I want to live. And I'm glad you're with me." Ollie's expression softened slightly at her words, but his voice remained rough. "You're quite the—" Michael squeezed her hand. "Always," he said. "On your terms, your life, your happiness." At this point, Janelle was able to experience the full force and thrill of victory. What started with the wedding as a symbol of control was now a celebration of choice, of courage, and of empowerment. This is a woman who was able to take chaos and turn it into triumph, strategy become reality, and a forced marriage into a statement of independence. The wedding was more than a ceremony. It was the turning point of her life. And as she stood by Michael, smiling into the future she'd fought so hard to take for herself, Janelle knew that the storm was finally gone, but the story was only beginning. The wedding was over, and the celebration still echoed in the large hall. Janelle Brown stood beside her new husband, Michael, as the last guests trickled out, and the space fell quiet, except for the low hum of the chandeliers overhead. The day had been a storm of emotions, tension, fear, anticipation, and finally, triumph. But now, in the stillness after the chaos, Janelle finally allowed herself to breathe and reflect. She glanced at Michael, who was adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, seemingly as composed as ever. But she noticed the faintest flicker of awe in his eyes as he looked at her, a silent acknowledgement of the courage and strategy that had carried her through the day. They had faced a situation neither had asked for, yet together they had navigated it, each respecting the other's intelligence and strength. And then there was her father, standing a little way off, silent and still. His face was etched with frustration that lingered, pride that was forced. He had wanted blind obedience, but what he got was something infinitely more. His daughter, proudly standing, circumspect and fearless. The realization must have bitten deep, she mused. It was a lesson well taught, one he needed to learn, if he truly had the best interest of his daughter at heart. As the staff began to clear the decorations, and the last of the guests departed, Janelle and Michael stepped outside onto the balcony. The cool evening air brushed against her skin, heavy with the scent of autumn flowers, and the sound of city life somewhere out in the distance. She felt a sense of calm for the first time that day. It was finally over. The whirlwind, the tension, the strategic chess moves. She had survived, and she had triumphed. Michael turned to her, his features soft yet serious. "You were incredible today," he said, his tone full of admiration and sincerity. "I knew you were strong, but I didn't think you could be this determined and fearless." Janelle smiled weakly, reflecting in her eyes a mix of relief, pride, and remaining adrenaline. "I had to be," she responded. "Not just for today, but for the rest of my life. I won't let anyone dictate my happiness, not even my father." Michael nodded, his eyes steady. "And I respect that. I'm here with you, not because I was chosen by someone else, but because I choose to be. On your terms, every step of the way." In its place came a strange, swelling warmth in her heart. It wasn't the fairy tale with all the butterflies and whirlwind passion she had dreamed of. Rather, something deeper. Mutual respect, shared intelligence, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they stood as equals on this journey. And Janelle knew that it was precisely her empowerment that did not exclude connection, but created the very foundation for a partnership based on trust, choice, and authenticity. And now, inside the hall, her father finally approached. His expression was guarded, though Janelle could see a certain softening, the corners of his mouth twisted in a way that showed he was finally beginning to accept the result. "Janelle," he began, the firmness in his voice quieter than usual for him. "I may not understand your means to an end, but the end seems to speak for itself. You have, actually, proven yourself in ways I had not anticipated. Perhaps I underestimated you." Janelle's heart beat faster. This wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was recognition. For her, that was good enough. "Thank you, Dad," she said calmly. "I hope you can realize my happiness does not take away from my love or respect for you. It simply confirms my autonomy." He studied her a moment, then gave a slow nod. The tension between them eased a fraction. The battle for control would not be over. Old habits die hard, but Janelle knew a door had creaked open. Her father had seen for himself that she was capable and intelligent and unshakable. He had seen that his attempts to run her life could no longer override her will. End quote. Later, as they drove home, Janelle reflected on the months that had led up to this moment. The shock of her father's announcement, the carefully orchestrated meetings with Michael, the subtle games of influence and observation, all of it had combined to create a woman who knew her worth, her boundaries, and her strength. What began as a forced engagement had turned into a crucible, forging her confidence and resilience. Over the next few weeks, Janelle and Michael began to build a life together. Unlike the traditional couples who were forced into marrying one another, they made sure to take steps to understand each other thoroughly, get their goals aligned, and establish a partnership based on respect. They divided all responsibilities, decisions, and challenges faced between them equally. And every day was a reminder that this union, born from a conflict of control, had the potential to become something so grand. Janelle's father, on the other hand, distanced himself from this new reality, adjusting to it little by little. He did still expect things and have his habits, but in due time learned the wisdom of stepping back. He saw that his daughter was no less happy because he was giving up, but more happy through her bravery and independence. And so it was that a new respect emerged between them, a respect tempered by conflict, strategy, and truth. For Janelle, the deepest lesson was personal. She had learned that empowerment was not about defiance or strategy, but about knowing one's value, insisting on one's choices, and conducting the dance of relationships with head and heart. She knew that life would always be full of struggle, but the resources she had developed, courage, strategic thought, emotional clarity, would see her through anything. She sat with Michael one quiet evening on the balcony that overlooked the city lights. Janelle allowed herself a rare moment of introspection. "I never imagined my life could be like this," she admitted softly. "Smile, never because I didn't dream of happiness, but because I thought it had to be handed to me. Now I see that I create it." Michael took her hand in his, holding it light. "And you have created something remarkable. Not just a marriage, but a life where both of us have a voice. Where both of us choose." The sincerity of his words pierced deep within her. She realized that what had been her carefully plotted plan for independence and control had evolved to something far more. A true partnership where strategy and emotion, power and respect might sit side by side. She had braved the storm of family expectations, societal norms, and personal doubt, and emerged victorious, stronger and wiser than ever before. In the weeks and months that followed, Janelle and Michael continued to grow together. They faced challenges, as all couples do, but their foundation was different. It was built on choice, understanding, and mutual empowerment. Janelle's father, once a symbol of control and authority, became an observer and, eventually, a supporter of the life his daughter had claimed for herself. And through it all, Janelle carried with her a deep sense of triumph, not over others, but over her own fears and doubts and limitations. She had taken a situation of imposed control and turned it into a story of personal triumph. She had learned that the truest form of revenge was not to hurt the people who sought to control her life, but to live boldly, make her own choices, and choose happiness on her own terms. One evening, as the couple walked hand in hand down a quiet city street, Janelle gazed up at the stars in a surging mix of gratitude and possibility. Life had tossed her about, full of misunderstanding, strategy, and even fear. Every one of these setbacks had led her here, to a life of her own design, to a partnership built on a foundation of choice and respect, and to a newfound confidence that would guide her in every future endeavor. This was just the beginning, Janelle knew, as life was not going to stop challenging her. But she knew one thing now with clarity. She was no longer a mere passenger in her own story. She was the writer, she was the decision-maker, and she was unstoppable. As she looked at Michael, his soft smile set, a quiet but resolute certainty took hold within her. Together they would face whatever the future held, standing side by side, equals in choosing to embrace life and their love for one another, unstoppable in life's path. And in that instant, Janelle Brown knew beyond any doubt that she had not only survived her father's plans, but also reshaped them into an opportunity for her own empowerment, love, and true independence. Hers was her story, and from this day on, she would write it precisely as she wanted.